Okay, let's get started. So again, welcome to this month's KeyShot webinar called Create Flexible Scenes for Look and Design Iterations. So yeah, my name is Dries Vervoort. I'm based in the Aarhus, Denmark office of Luxion. And yeah, let's just get straight into it. So in this webinar, we'll be discussing how you can use certain KeyShot features and workflows to iterate on the look and the appearance of the various elements of your scene. But before we begin, I just want to give you these quick notes. So this session is being recorded, so it will be available for all attendees as a YouTube video. The slideshow I have here will also be provided, and the KSPs of the scenes that I will show will also be available as a download after this after the webinar is processed, basically, for uploading. A few notes on my computer. I am running this session on a dual Intel Xeon machine, which in total has 16 physical cores or 32 threads. I have about 32 gigabytes of memory, and I'm running Windows 10 Professional. If you're familiar with the KeyShot camera benchmark scene, then I get about 185 frames per second. So that's just to give you an idea of the performance of the machine I'm running with. So as always, if you have any questions, just ask them inside the GoToWebinar questions panel, and we will try to answer them as we go along. Oops. So the contents of this webinar, I will start with a little introduction, also about the provider of our models. And then I will kick off with a live session where I will firstly show basically the general scene setup of the scene I have here. So we'll go a bit deeper into how I created the ground material and the emissive panels. And then I will go into the different features for creating scene variations. So firstly, I will cover model sets, then I will go on to multi-materials, and finally image styles and studios. Now, it's worth noting that basically all of these features are KeyShot Pro features. So much of what I will show today is going to be available in KeyShot Pro. And I also want to conclude with a few quick notes on final rendering, when those variations have been built into your scene, how you can basically render out those variations to images. And if there's time left, I will definitely do some Q&A. So the models you see here, these avatar drones, which are really nice, have been created by Simon Williamson, who goes by his alter ego Row Zero. So if you're not familiar with his work already, I would definitely check out his website. So row0.com. And let me just open this. Oops. So this is definitely worth checking out. Simon Williamson is a long-time KeyShot user, and he's done some really amazing models. So he's actually as far as I remember, a design professor, and a CAD instructor and a model making instructor at the Wentworth Institute of Technology in Boston. So, and he does a lot of crazy rhino models. So there's a lot of detail in this, and a very playful style. So definitely worth checking out. So he does have an Instagram account with a lot of great images that are just nice for inspiration for modeling and rendering. So definitely worth checking out. So just an overview of what I will be talking about again today. So first off are model sets, which we will use today for controlling model states. So model sets are quite flexible, but one way to use them is to have variations of like model positions. So if I have the general setup of my scene here, then I can capture this in one model set, but I can easily create different model sets to create variations of basically the same geometry. So here you can see in the first image, these drones are kind of flying in a straight direction, all in the same direction. Whereas in this model set, one of them is kind of taking off. And then in a third one, I have made this like crisscross flying pattern. So those three states have been captured in three separate model sets. Multi-materials we will use to capture and control material variations and combinations. So the same principles as capturing the state of models applies sort of to multi-materials as well. So multi-materials allow you to capture certain material state. So here you have the base version for the image that we also used for the newsletter. And then using multi-materials, you can easily create or switch materials to a different variation. And you can create as many materials as you want using multi-materials. So here I changed the thrusters and these contrails and the ground and the different body colors. I all changed them using different multi-materials. With image styles, we can create quick image variations. And here, yeah, I'm just showing examples now of how they can be used. I will go into depth in the live demonstration how, yeah, these features are actually used. So here is one thing you can do with an image style. So this is an image that has not been processed in Photoshop. This is straight out of KeyShot. So in KeyShot 8 with image styles and photographic image styles, we added, for instance, control over the color, so you can easily desaturate your images to create this kind of noir appearance. You can also do the opposite and increase the saturation and do some kind of color filtering. So I actually made this image warmer than the base. And this one is cooler. So what we also introduced was the concept of front plates. So again, this is straight out of the KeyShot. This is basically the same image as this one, but then a transparent PNG was overlaid to create this kind of electronic schematic on top of the base rendering. So you can also control the opacity of front plates with a slider. Just a variation of that. And here, this is actually not text in the presentation. This is a front plate that is a transparent image with this text. So you can easily lay that on top of your renderings, or if you want to watermark your images. So it can be used for that as well. So here's just another variation. So here I made a kind of a degraded film image, which is just put on top as a front plate. So you can create some very cool artistic effects using front plates, and all without using any external image editor. So this is all within KeyShot. So yeah, this was a very quick overview of the features I wanted to cover, and now I will get to straight get into KeyShot. And as I said before, I do want to start with a little overview of the scene as I set it up here. So let me start by importing a model, one of the models I received from Simon, and I will pick a Rhino model and just drop it into my empty KeyShot scene. So I will just accept these standard settings. So now here is my model. In the scene tree, I will just make sure I snap it to the ground. So I select the top model, go into position, and then click snap to ground. Now, what you see in this case, this is a Rhino model, and what you see with Rhino models, if you don't put stuff on separate layers with separate colors, is that whatever is on the default color is going to have this solid black appearance. So one drawback of this is that it's hard to see the actual shape. So what I tend to do, just to make that just more recognizable, is to convert all the material types from diffuse to something else like paint. So you could go into each of these materials, double click, and then change from advanced to paint, and then you get some reflection, so the shape becomes more recognizable. But what you can do very quickly is just go in the scene tab, go to the top of your models, right click the top model, and here you go to material, change material type. This will change the type of all materials contained in that selection. And then you select, for instance, paint. And now all those materials are going to have reflections. And now the geometry becomes much more understandable already. So what I did in this image is basically have these kind of trails and then these thrusters, which are basically textured emissives. And I just want to quickly show what I've done there. So for those trails, I've actually modeled some strips in SolidWorks, and that could be any software, but I will just in this case pick the straight ones and drop it in the scene, and then I will add it to the scene. Just accept those settings. Now this comes in a bit too big, so I will just scale this down a bit. And just to center my camera, I will right click and center and fit models. And now I want to position it that it's aligned like straight behind these blades. So I will select the object, open the move tool, and then I will rotate it. So I hold shift while rotating to snap to fixed increments. And then I can move it into position. So I could do this manually. A quick way to like center it is to snap to a pivot. So you can use the move tool settings for this. So I pick a pivot first, click this pick button, and then you select either an object in the list or in the real-time view. And in this case, I want to snap to those rotor blades. Click OK, and then when the move tool gizmo is basically moved to that position, I can then snap to pivot. And then if I reset it, then I can move that into place. And then I can just duplicate this. And again, now I want to snap it to one of the front thrusters. So I select the thruster there, snap to pivot, reset, and then I move it like this. And for this one, I want to angle it a slight bit, like this. And now I want to make a mirrored version on the other side. So I will duplicate it again. And now I could do the same, but basically this is a mirrored version. So I just can mirror the transformations I have here in the position tab. So in this case, this is rotated by -24 something. If I just make this positive, then that's tilted in a mirrored way. And then I have to move it by basically inversing one of these values. Now, if I press the Z button, I get this legend here. So now I know, now I basically want to inverse it along X. So with the duplicate selected, I go to the X translation and I put a minus there. And now I basically have a mirrored copy of my contrail. Then for the thrusters, I actually used standard KeyShot cylinders. So I added cylinders like this. So let's just go to edit, add geometry, and then cylinder. And then here as well, I picked one of these and then snap the pivot. And then I reset the pivot to make it align to the cylinder again. And then I can move it like this. And then I want to make sure it's sitting below the blades, like so. And then I duplicate it. And here as well. Oh, sorry. Like this. Mirror those transforms. Oops, I messed something up. Let me just do it manually here. And then I do it one final time. And then I snap it to the one on the rear. So now for the actual material. So what I did here, and I'm first going to make the background a solid color by pressing the C button, and then I will go into adjust in the in the background section of the environment and change it to black. And then here I double click this part, and then I change the material to emissive, like this. And this one should apply to all three parts. So I just do shift left click to copy the material and then shift right click on the other part so that they are now linked. So now when I change the color, that's going to be linked. And then I basically textured it. So what I did here is, and yeah, I will do this in a material graph. It's not a material graph webinar, but I just want to show the basic setup. So I made a texture, a color gradient texture, and then if I press C here, then I get a preview of the texture. And I want to make sure the scale matches sort of the size of my object. So if I click on the object, then I see it's 325 millimeters long. So if my scale of the planar gradient is that, then it's going to match basically the size of the object. So I made the gradient like this, so that when I apply it to the opacity, then it's basically going to fade in and then fade out again. And then you can add complexity by combining it with different maps. So what I did here is I created a color composite, and then I added another texture, a mesh texture. And again, if I preview this, then I can change the mapping to planar. And then if I go down to shape and pattern, I change this to line. And if I scale this down, then I can connect this to the background of the color composite. And then just want to make sure the alpha mode is here opaque, so it's seen as a solid texture. And then if I multiply this, then I get those stripes. So I did some more stuff, but you can plug that apart in the scene that will be made available later on. But I did something similar for the cylinders as well. So just wanted to show this. So here I have another scene, which is basically already those cylinders and those panels set up. And I've already made like a small composition here. So if I go to the camera tab, let me just remove the twist. So I made this composition of one of these Scorpion drones, and then 2 copies of the same for the other. So, and this is captured into one model set. So if I go to the scene tab, then here on the left you can see this arrow. If I click this, then I get my model sets sidebar, and here I have a model set called newsletter, because this is basically the composition I used for the newsletter image. So if I now wanted to create a new composition of models, then I would create a new model set. So let me just go ahead and do that. So I will click Add Model Set. And here I'm presented with a few options. Let me first type in a name. So what I want to do now is create the crisscross variation. like this one. So we'll call this crisscross. And so you have a few options here. So you can choose which models you want to include. In this case, I want to include the blue ground object as well as the 3 avatars. So I will leave these checked. So I have animations on the rotor blades, and if that's the case, then you get these options. So I also leave these checked for now. And what I usually do as well is link the materials. So that's make sure that the new model set or the models in the new model set will use the same materials as the originating model set. So I check this and then I click OK. So now I have a new model set captured here. So what I can do now is create a new composition. So I will select this model and I will move this up and rotate it like this. And then I will pick one of the others and again move this so it flies in a different direction, maybe like so. And then the last one. So now I move those models in the crisscross model set. So you can see that because there's a check mark here in this box. So I can now switch back to this original model set by just double clicking it. And now you can see this still retains the original positions of my models. So one way to use model sets is to create these position variations. Now, as you remember, perhaps I enabled link materials. So that means, for instance, if I go into the original model set and I assign a material to one of these parts. So let me just find a nice Excelta paint and drag and drop this onto my model. So now, because I checked that link materials checkbox, if I now go into the crisscross model set, you can see now that material is applied there as well. So that is now linked. Now, I could also want to have completely separate materials. And the way you would do that is by basically unlinking materials. So you could, of course, in the new model set, right click here and you could unlink material. Now, if I drag another material on that part, you can see now that's a separate instance of that material. So switching back and forth, you can see now that part got unlinked. Now, if I wanted to apply this to all those parts, then I would have to manually shift left click, right click to those parts and link it. Now that could be, depending on the amount of parts, it could be a very laborious process. So let me just go back with Control Z, like this. And now it's basically as it was before, so linked across model sets. One trick here to make all materials within a particular model unlinked or unique is to select the model. So select the entirety of the model you want to be separate, material-wise at least. And then, so with this selection active, I can now right-click and I can say here, isolate materials to selections. So if I do that, now when I perform the same operation and I drag and drop a material onto those parts, if I now go back to my newsletter, you can see now that's been unlinked from that model set. And that's because this isolate materials to selection makes sure that all materials within that selection are now basically separate from everything else. So this is a handy way to basically break that link you would have created when linking materials when creating model sets. So let me just open another scene where I have done a bit more setup. So see. So here is the same basic setup as in that first model set, but with a bit more developed materials. So again, I have the same model set here, but now I want to cover basically how you can create variations within certain materials. So perhaps for these contrails, these trailing emissive planes, you want to have a few variations. So if I double click, for instance, these orange ones, then you can see that's an emissive material. And if you open the material graph, you can see there's some setup already done. So to create variations of this, you can just enable multi-material for this material. So if you click this button next to the material graph button, that will convert the material into a multi-material, and the setup it had will be the first submaterial that is available. So now I can basically add variations of materials, and we have a few options here which I will discuss now. So you can add a basic new submaterial, which by default will add a new blank plastic. Now, in this case, that's not very interesting because we basically want to retain the texture setup we had existing for the other materials. So let me just select and remove this. So in this case, we actually want to make a duplicate. And now you should be able to see. Oh. Yeah. So now I make a duplicate, and now I basically keep the same texture structure that I had before. And with this one, the second variation selected, I can now change the color for the emissive material. And I can rename those submaterials by just double clicking them, and I call this one blue, and then the other one orange. So this way I can very quickly change the look of my material. So this option here, so the second one creates a regular duplicate and will copy all of the setup of that exists inside the material graph. This third option, duplicate material link textures, this will basically create a new variation. But if I now look in the material graph, let me just align those nodes, you can see that it has a new emissive material, but it keeps the exact same texture setup that existed for the other variations. So this makes the material graph much less cluttered, and also make sure that if you change one of the properties, they will affect all the submaterials basically. So this way you can easily make those different variations. And you can do that for as many objects as you like. So maybe you want variations for the material here on these body parts. So let me just quickly change this into performance mode, so it resolves a bit faster. So again, here you double click this material and then you change it into a multi-material. And here you can basically add variations of the same material, or you can just go to the library and drag and drop from the material library into this list, and that will add those materials as a variation, as a submaterial for you. So now you can easily switch there as well. And you can add as many as you like. And then it makes sense to give it sensible names. So that's the scorpion body. And then we do the same for the other ones. So we double click this material, convert it into a multi-material, just drag and drop variations into this list. And then the same here, convert it into a multi-material, just drag and drop some variations. So now you can very quickly iterate on the exact look of your scene by just clicking on these materials and changing the state of the multi-material basically. So in this scene, I'm just quickly going to create another model set. So again, here I will create this crisscross model set, and I will link the materials because I do want the materials to be the same across model sets. So I click OK. So now you can see that in the new model set, those multi-materials are retained. And also if I switch to the other model set, you can see the change within the multi-material now applies across model sets as well. So again, I will move this one up. And this one a bit to the side. Like so. So now we have those two states. So we have different model sets, a few different multi-materials. So you can tie those combinations also more closely together by using studios. But before I do that, let me actually create a camera for the crisscross model set as well. So this looks good. So I will create a new camera and call this crisscross. So what I want to do now is basically change the state so that this model set goes together with this camera. And that's why you use studios. So I will use the studios panel for that. And in the ribbon, so if I enable text, you can see here on the right side, studios. So also this is a pro feature. So I will add a studio. So, and then by default, a camera, the active camera and environment are already added as selections. And for Studio One, I basically want to have my newsletter camera, and I also want to add a model set, and I want it to be the first one. So I just double click here. So I enable model sets, and then I double click on the newsletter model set, and now that's activated as the sole model set. So when that's done, I double click here on the first studio, and then I duplicate it, and then here I change the camera to crisscross, and then the model set I change by double clicking on the crisscross model set. So now if I change between studios, you can see that now the model set as well as the camera view changes. So what you can do with studios as well is to make presets of multi-materials. So when you have existing multi-materials in your scene, you can also tie them to studios basically. So to do that, you select your studio, and then you enable multi-materials. And let me just detach this and enlarge the view. So when you enable multi-materials, you get here a drop down, and this will list all the visible or existing multi-materials within your model set. So what I can do here is I select the multi-material I want to set. So that's, for instance, scorpion body. And then I make a selection here. So maybe in this studio, this should be this yellow solar eclipse submaterial. And for the avatar body, which is this one, then maybe this should be the green metallic paint. In Studio 2, I can now do the same, basically, add multi-materials here. And maybe in this studio, the scorpion body, this one, should be red. And the avatar body, this one, should be that silver. So now if I switch between studios, you can see that now the materials for these two models change as I switch the studios. So that's very powerful to create, yeah, different variations of basically existing materials if they are multi-materials. And with the studios, you can combine them with different model sets and cameras, and also image styles. And let me just close the studios and cover image styles a bit. So image styles can be created here in the last tab of the project panel, the project window, so in the image tab. So there's a few, so the default image style is a basic image style. So if you click here to create a new image style, that will be a basic one. Here you have the same controls as you had in KeyShot 7, basically. But what we've added in KeyShot 8 are photographic image styles, and they give you a lot more control over the look of your scene. And these are great to just create very different variations of your image, basically, without having to re-render. So any change you make here in this step will not cause a re-rendering of your scene. So these are just post-processing options. So with photographic, one of the more important options here is the tone mapping. And you will see that here with this exposure slider, you actually have very nice control over the overall brightness of your scene without actually the scene blowing out. So if I go back to the basic image style, create a new basic image style. Here, if I adjust the exposure, if you just look closely here on the white parts, then you will see that that tends to blow out a lot, very quickly. So with the photographic image style, that doesn't quite happen. So it's a bit smarter in how it treats that dynamic contrast. So now, of course, it did change because I changed the camera. So before you make any changes to image styles, it's often a good idea to just lock the camera, so you cannot accidentally change the view. So exposure, you can adjust the overall brightness. Then with contrast, yeah, it's kind of self-explanatory. You can add some more punch and contrast to your image. The white balance is the one you can use to basically make your image warmer if you lower the value, or cooler if you increase this value. So this has a range from -1 to 1. So this is like a white balance warmth adjustment. Then we also have more fine control over the exact curve. So you can enable the curve here, and this allows you to control the various aspects of the image. So the shadow regions, the mid-tone regions, the lights, the whites, and the highlights of the image. And this gives you a very nice targeted control of the image. So by lowering the shadows, you actually make the darkest parts of the image darker. By increasing it, you increase the brightness. So this is probably a personal preference, but I usually always work with the sliders first. You can also go into the curve itself and then drag the point up and down here. But I usually find the control a bit more granular and fine with the sliders. So the exact relation between these points is very dependent on the actual image and how much dark and bright areas you actually have in your scene. So it's hard to give any hard recommendation, but I usually just pull these sliders, just weigh back and forth just to see the actual effect within the scene, and then when I have an idea about the effect, then I just set it to a more sensible value. But it's usually me just by trial and error seeing what works. What you sometimes see if you make these very drastic kinks in the curve, that it will create distorted colors. So you have to be cautious not to use too dramatic a color. So yeah, there's a few more adjustments here. So if you want to create that noir kind of effect, then you can enable color. So for all these, before you can use them, you have to check the checkbox here, and then the controls will become available. So if you want to create a noir image, all you have to do is basically pick the saturation and drop it all the way to -1. So this is good. This is nice for artistic purposes, but I actually also, while developing a scene, will sometimes set the saturation to -1 because it just allows me to see the contrast within the scene, irrespective, independently of the colors. And the vibrance sort of works like saturation, but it will be more targeted, whereas the saturation is like a global saturation where tiny values will also create a quite drastic change. The vibrance is more subtle, and it will target like the brightest colors first. Another thing that was majorly improved in KeyShot 8 was the way bloom was handled. So again, to enable it, you enable bloom, and you set an intensity. This can go up to 2. So let me just put it to the maximum value of 2. And then the bloom radius will basically be the size in pixels of the softened blurred effect. So to see it more apparently, I have to increase this value here. So what you see now is a completely softened image that is not very useful as output. But what we added in 8 is this bloom threshold, and if I increase the slider, you can see that what you can do here is basically target the bloom to the brightest areas of your image. So if this is 0, it's basically applying a bloom to everything. If you increase this, then if I set this, for instance, to 1, you can see that the brightest regions, which are these emissive planes, now have bloom, while the less bright parts of the image, like the materials on the body and the ground, do not have that bloom. So this is very useful and makes it a much more useful feature than bloom was in previous KeyShot versions. So basically, if you increase the bloom threshold, that will basically increasingly limit the bloom effect to the brighter regions of your image. Vignette the same, enable it, and then you can apply some vignetting. Now the front plates, they are applied as layers. So I open the layers, and here I can apply a front plate by first checking the checkbox here, and that will ask me where to load the front plate from. And I have a few ones prepared. So I will go into this folder and let me pick, for instance, the electronic circuit. So this is a transparent PNG that I prepared in Photoshop. So if I load this, then this gets basically overlaid on top of my scene. And then we just, at least for now, we have basic controls. So you can still adjust the opacity to define how sharply that blends with the background, which is then the rendering inside KeyShot. So just like with multi-materials, you can create variations of this. So because it's again just a list. So here with this image style selected, I can just duplicate it and then pick another front plate, for instance, and I can pick this film decay. And now without ever going into a Photoshop or other image editor, I can just make some quite cool image variations. And I think for this one, it makes sense to make it desaturate so it looks like an old film. And now switching the image styles, I can just very quickly create very different image variations. And now the rendering is still running, but changing these does not trigger a refresh of the rendering. And then I make, let me just make a final one based off of this and use a different front plate. And here I now have an image with this text as a transparent PNG. And then I can just blend it like this. And now these different image styles can also be hooked up to studios. So if I select Studio 1, maybe this should have the the noir kind of film, the noir image style. So I just rename this here, and then I select it in the studio. So I enable image styles, and then I select noir. And then for the second studio, I want it to be the final one. With the webinar text. So I enable it here in the studio with the studio selected, and then I select webinar text. And now if I change the studios, then I'm changing all these elements. So I'm changing cameras, environment, image style, model sets, and multi-materials. So I think, yeah, we're run out of time. I still want to do the Q&A, but before we round off the webinar, I do want to mention that if you have the setup with studios, model sets, different cameras, different image styles, if you have all that existing in the scene, you can actually leverage that for final rendering. So just a quick note here, if you go into the render window by clicking the render button or pressing the, oh, sorry. So if you go into the render output window, then inside the queue option, you can add jobs here. So you can add jobs manually, but you can also automatically use the setup from the different elements. So if you click add cameras, you can add the different cameras, which will render out images of the state of the scene with the different cameras. You can also do the same for model sets, for multi-materials. So you can here, the same way as we selected the multi-materials in the studios, you select first the multi-materials, and then you can add the different variations. And you can also automatically add the different studios. So yeah, that's about it for this week's webinar. I know we rounded the hour, but I'm still, yeah. If there are any questions, then I will definitely be happy to answer them.
Hey, Dries, thank you so much for that very informative webinar. I think there was a lot of really great content in there that users are going to find very useful. We did have some questions that I think would be good to address. One that stood out to me was a question about the thumbnails for model sets and studios, and the question was, why aren't those thumbnails updating to show what's in the scene? So maybe you can talk a little bit about how those thumbnails are generated automatically when model sets or studios are first created, and that they must be manually updated as changes are made to the scene.
Yes, that's a good point. So let me just enlarge these. So yeah, initially I worked from a scene where I deleted stuff, so the thumbnail did not reflect what I was seeing at that point. But let me just let me change this to this noir kind of image style, so it's pretty obvious what's going on here. So if I now create with this state of the scene a new model set, just call it test, and edit, then it's actually going to make that, make that the thumbnail. So it takes the current state of the real-time view and then applies it as a thumbnail. Now, if at any point I do change my mind and I want this to be reflected in the thumbnail, then I can go into the model sets overview, select the model set that's currently active, and then manually select render preview, and then that change will be propagated into the thumbnail. So, and the same applies for the studios. So here with the studios active, so here I actually set it up so that it uses this noir image style, but that's not automatically reflected inside the studio thumbnail. It would be too compute intensive to always update the thumbnail, because it basically requires some background rendering. So I have to manually change it here. So I render the thumbnail, And then I can do the same for the second one, like this. So if you have a lot of studios, then it can be a lot of work to even manually select them and press this button. So you can also click on the gear icon, and then you can here render the thumbnails, and that will go through all of them. So you don't have to select them first. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that was perfect. Thank you. Another question that came about was in regards to resolution, and if resolution can be saved with studios or image styles. If, for example, you had multiple studios where you had perhaps different aspects, maybe
Yeah,
1:1 or 16:9, can you talk about maybe the best practices for achieving something like that?
yeah. I can only talk about my own best practices. So you cannot currently include the resolution or the aspect inside an image style. So that's also why it's shown above this list. So this makes it clear that whatever the image style contains is whatever is below the list. So that means that the resolution or aspect is not included. So in this case, the aspect here also of my front plates, and that's another important point. Yeah, it's maybe a bit of a sidetrack, but if you use front plates, ideally, well, for best placement results, it should match the aspect of your real-time view. So what I usually do is I just include my aspect or my intended real-time resolution inside the studio name. That's usually what I do. So if I have a studio, for instance, if I make a, let me just make a duplicate of this studio, and if this has, for instance, if this should have a square ratio, and perhaps with a different camera. So now you can see that the front plate is actually getting stretched, and that's because, yeah, it doesn't have the same ratio as my real-time resolution. So that's an important point. So let me just go ahead and remove it here. So if the front plate should match, I should make a square version of this front plate. So let me get rid of this, and then in this Studio 3, oops, I include that here as well. And then I set it to be this new camera. Yeah, I should do a better job of naming things. And then yeah. Oops. Yeah, so usually, so you can now see that, yeah, my image aspect is not coming along, but because I included into the studio name, I can. I mean, it's still very hackish because it's still as much manual work as it has always been, but that's at least how I try to deal with it. It would be
Yeah,
nice if eventually if we somehow could include it, because it's a common request I've seen as well.
sure, definitely. Yeah, that's the same recommendation that I would have given, is to include it in the name of the studio as just a reminder that it should be changed for the final render output. So I think that's it for the questions for today. Once again, thank you for that excellent presentation. And a recording of this will be posted to YouTube. Please visit our YouTube page at youtube.com/KeyShot3D to check out more webinars, quick tips, and learning material. And we'll see you again next month. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. See you.